little bit from Monday. So machine learning and bidirectional transformations. In particular, that machine learning is going to be supervised machine learning and bidirectional transformations. And so I want to tell you a little bit about each of these to make sure we're all up to the same level before we actually get around to doing the real work. So first of all, some lenses, okay? And don't panic if I start with lenses that don't look like what you think they are. But I think I'm in a room of category theorists of some kind or another, and category theorists love fibrations. So in particular, opfibrations, and so I'm going to talk about a split opfibration here. And by the way, split opfibrations are the best kind of lens. You can't always have them, but they're a great kind of lens. So if you know about split opfibrations, you already know about a kind of lens. And I said these are bidirectional transformations. They're about synchronizing systems. So let me cover up or stand in front of or something half the slide and just start over here. So here are my two systems, okay, S and V. S is kind of the big system. V is called V because it's a view of the big system. So in some sense, S knows everything and V knows some of that stuff. These are categories. They're categories because they're the state spaces of the systems. So the objects are just states the system might be in, and the arrows are transitions between states. And G is a functor. So G is going to say, if you've got a state of S, like I said, S knows everything, you can deduce, just hit it with G, a state of V. No problem at all. I said bidirectional transformations, that's one direction. Okay, on the other hand, you can probably guess going the other way is harder, because S knows lots of stuff V doesn't know. If you've got a new state of V, how do I get a state of S out of that? Because it only knows some things, right? And so this is meant to be the answer of that. So let's check that out. This is now a little s, so a state of the system, an object in S, which happens to lie over, I'm going to say, G of S. So those two states are consistent. Okay, that is what you would derive from that state of the system as the state of the view. But someone comes along and says, hang on a minute, I want to change the view. So they change it via this little f here into some V, some other state different from that one. And the problem, sometimes called in old literature the view update problem, is hang on a minute, if we've changed the view, how should we change the original system? Make sense so far? Okay, how we should change the original system can kind of be characterized like this, but let's actually put it in. So how we change the original system is we get something that lifts, a K, which says how you change S to, and the most important thing most people think is actually the new state, S prime. And a split opfibration just gives that to you. It is the story. A lens more generally is going to be like this story. You're going to have a way of lifting to get good things, but split opfibration is the beautiful one and is the one you're all meant to be familiar with. Okay, so far? If you really are familiar with split opfibrations, you'll know, first of all, when you glance at this, that is a comma category that just captures the information that was the input. And that's a functor which says, if you've got that much, I can tell you an object. It turns out because of functoriality, I can actually tell you the arrow that goes to the object. And even cooler, that arrow's got a universal property, and that's op-Cartesian, and that's what makes a split opfibration a wonderful thing. It means in some sense it's the best lifting you could have, and indeed lots of the examples of this that were built before the bidirectional transformations community even called themselves a bidirectional transformations community. Lots of that stuff was actually using these discrete opfibrations, although they didn't know they were using discrete opfibrations because they're the obvious idea. Okay, we're all right so far? My favourite kind of lens. So, turns out you don't always have, when you've got this particular way of deriving your views from your system, you don't always have a discrete opfibration. Sorry, I didn't mean discrete. Split, I meant all those times. A split opfibration. And so, you might hope for something more general, or even if you do have a split opfibration, sometimes the engineers don't pick it. They give you a way of lifting that isn't the op-Cartesian arrow. And so Zinneby Diskin is responsible for introducing a thing called a D-lens, which I like to call it that because it kind of reminds me of Diskin. It's also because he likes to call it delta, but I don't like to call it delta, so for reasons I can tell you if you ask me. But D-lens, which is the sort of split opfibration without the universal property. So we're still going to have a lifting when we've got that input data, and it's going to lie over F, sure, and it's going to be kind of functorial, but it doesn't have to be op-Cartesian. and that arises in lots of applications. Okay. I've got some stuff down the bottom about axioms. They all come out of things like functoriality, but they give them these funny names. So I better just tell you these names so that if you meet them along the way in the morning, you know what they are. So the P so named is the put. That's the give me a new state of the big system. It's called putting back. You can think of putting back and getting, if you like GitHub or something, or like all kinds of things where getting is usually easy and putting is a bit harder. And so the so-called put-get axiom says if you do a put and then you do a get of it, what you get is exactly the stuff that you did the put on. In other words, that this does lie over that. Makes pretty good sense. The so-called get-put one, also sometimes called put identities, says if you're in this situation and the F you pick is the identity, you don't do anything, and then you try to put it back, you ought to result not do anything. And so that's from functoriality. And put is the other aspect of functoriality, which is if you try to do a couple of puts, you can do them one at a time and lift each one, or you can do the composite and lift it. So they're common axioms. People sometimes argue about various ones. There'll be some circumstances where some of those axioms aren't satisfied, and then they're different kinds of lenses, more generalized kinds of lenses. I need some of those today, by the way, in ways that, again, 2 years ago, I would never have thought I would go there. So axioms I thought 2 years ago would always apply, don't apply in some of what I'm going to say today. Okay, so we've had split up fibration, sometimes called a C lens. The C is for category theorist because it's category theorist kinds of lenses. D lenses, Diskin style lenses, for the more general case of you don't have the universal property. There's a sequence of stuff, a sequence of results by Bob Roseborough and me, kind of showing that a big range of lenses, very big range of lenses that you might care about. Lots of people have invented E lenses and P lenses and Q lenses and R lenses and all kinds of lenses, V lenses and W lenses. There's an alphabet soup of these lenses, and it turns out they're all captured by the D lens idea. So if you understand D lenses, you've got everything you need. Yeah?
What's the absolute value?
The absolute value in that case is just saying, for this comma category, just take the objects. And for this P, then it's just a function into the arrows. And so this is saying, if you give me the right information, I'll just give you a function that takes that and turns it into an arrow, but that function has to satisfy these things. On the previous slide, I gave you a functor, and you got those things from the functor. But once you restrict down to the so-called D-lens case, it's just a function, but a well-behaved function.
Doesn't the axiom put make it a functor?
No, but we can talk about it later. Oh, okay. I said this might not look like what you saw earlier in the week about a lens, and indeed people sometimes talk about set-based lenses. And so in the case where these categories happen to be merely sets, I'm in a little trouble when I say that to category theorists because they immediately think, oh, discrete categories. And fine. But equally well, you could think co-discrete categories. So a co-discrete category is one that just has a unique arrow between every pair of objects. And that is another way of getting exactly sets. So if these are co-discrete categories, then the functor is just a function. So we just have sets and functions, sure. And the information I said was meant to be the input information is an S and something you can derive from it, and an arrow, but who cares because you know the other end of the arrow, V, and once you know the two ends of an arrow, you know the arrow because there's a unique arrow. And so the real information is just an S and a V, and that's why it's written like that. And a function, because hey, we're just talking sets now. So set-based lenses are ones that are used by lots of people in lots of circumstances. They're a special case of a D-lens, sure. Sometimes as the category theorist, I feel like they're a really impoverished case. And really you can lose a lot of information in the set-based case, but other times, sure, they really do capture all you need, and they are D-lenses where the categories are co-discrete. Okay. So again, we might have the same kind of axioms. I don't need to go into them. Notice the arrow's not used. And this says to me that I should remark about bimorphic. So have I got that right? Jules coined these terms monomorphic and bimorphic. And this is what Jules would call a monomorphic lens. Let me tell you what I mean and just draw a quick picture to take us back to Neil to make sure I connect up with Neil's lenses. You didn't coin monomorphic. What did you coin? Bimorphic. Oh, okay. And so it's bimorphic and the other ones. One morphic. Okay.
Polymorphic is the other one.
Okay. Anyway, I'll try to just say bimorphic and not say another word. So there's my lenses and there's bimorphic ones. The story is this. If you give one of these lenses to a typical Haskell programmer or something to program, they are likely to build something like what you saw Neil describe on Monday. And so Neil had lots of boxes that tended to have 4 ports on them. And I'm going to call that port S and that port V, and just because I'm starting to connect up with what we've said here, right? Okay, but why 4 ports? Well, because the V you put in there is the new V, which is different from the V that came out of here. And so many programmers will say, look, that input is a different thing, so let me call it V prime, okay? And what I get out at the other end is a different S to the original one, so let me call it S prime, all right? And that's the kind of box you were seeing the other day. Actually, Jeremy and a few other people sometimes like to draw these boxes with internal wires, which are kind of helpful. So just to draw this stuff, I said S gives you a V via a G, so yeah, indeed, there's a wire going down there which we'll call G, but just gives you the V. On the other hand, if you've got an S and a V prime, then you can get an S prime, and so what I've got is sort of a way of turning that wire around and joining it on there and doing P to say, give me the original S and the new V prime, and I'll give you a new S prime. Sound okay? Okay, so these are the so-called bimorphic lenses. Often people won't talk about these axioms when they're talking about bimorphic lenses, because if you want to go to greatest generality possible, well, hey, these might be different types, S prime and V prime, and if they're different types, then you can't even state the axioms, because the axioms involve saying, hey, the thing that you got back here was the same as the one you had there, but they're in different types. So, sound all right? Okay. I'm a category theorist. I care about these things composing, of course, and I didn't bother putting in a slide about composition, but having drawn that box for you, you can see right away how composition is going to work. Okay, so let's suppose I've got a couple of these. Okay, so there's another one of these boxes, and it's going to go down to W and W prime or something like that, and it's got its own G, which I might call H, and it's got its own P, which I might call Q, and there's the arrow bit turning it around. They making sense so far? Do I have to say more? Can you see the composition of bimorphic lenses? Right, so the get for the composite is going to, well, if I put in a little s, it's going to be H of G of little s. Fair enough, you just feed it through, no problem. On the other hand, the put is a little more interesting. It's got to take a little s and a W prime and feed me out an S prime. So how am I going to do it? I think the picture tells you the story, but let's check. Well, I'm going to get there eventually by a P. So let me write P of, but what am I going to put into that? Well, to put into that P, it's going to eventually at the other end have the S, because I'm putting it in with the S, but it's got to have something here. How can I get something here? Well, I can do the Q. The Q will give me something there. And what do I use for it? I use, well, W prime, and I've got to give a V thing. So how can I get a V thing? Well, the obvious way, which is I meant to base it on S. So take the S, hit it with a G, and I'll have a V, and I can put that in there. Sound all right? So G of S. Look okay? Anyway, the whole point of all that is just, I don't want to write down formulas like that and have you puzzling over them. The point is, if you look at the strings and made something up, you'd make them up. Okay.
Is that just for set-based lenses?
That is just for set-based lenses, but similar things happen for all the others. If you've ever composed split opfibrations, you know how to do it for the C-lens case. The D-lens case is the same kind of story without the universal properties. And it is a sort of enriched version of, I don't mean that in a technical sense, of what it says over there. But that's just for set-based lenses. I've done it for the bimorphic boxes, but in fact, if it turns out that you want to treat S and S prime as the same type, V and V prime as the same type, and require the axioms earlier, then it's exactly the set-based lenses from the 2 slides ago. Okay, I think that's probably just about enough about lenses. So let's talk about supervised machine learning for a minute. Okay. I'm deciding whether to be embarrassed, but supervised machine learning almost always starts with a picture of a cat. And so this is a particular kind of supervised machine learning. This is a neural network. And there's all these question marks because the whole point is we're going to try and find weights to put on all those connections that will result in this thing being fed some inputs which are kind of the pixels, right? So it says 64, but there's probably lots more than 64. So it's the brightness of a certain colour at a certain pixel in some image. And at the other end, it's meant to say 0 or 1, cat or not cat. Okay. I don't really want to do neural networks in detail, but you can probably get the idea really quickly anyway, right? So there is a pixel value here. The idea is it's weighted by whatever weight we actually replace these question marks with, so just multiplied by some number, and fed to the next one along, but it'll also receive uns from the other ones, and they all get added up, and that so-called neuron has basically a threshold function, a sigmoidal function that's going to say if the incoming weights add up to enough, I'll give a lot of stuff out, and if they add up to not much, I'll give hardly anything out, and somewhere in between, it's nonlinear is the important thing. Okay, a threshold function, and it works its way through there. Okay, so supervised machine learning is, we'll show this thing lots of pictures of cats, and it will tell us various things, but we'll tell it, this is the supervised part, what it should have told us. So when we show it that cat over there, if it doesn't say 1, we say, the answer's meant to be 1. And backpropagation is our way of adjusting the weights a little bit based on that information so that it's a bit better. Sound okay? Okay. This sort of machine learning's been around since the 70s. And there was some good work in the 70s about how it might go, but wow, the technology was hard. Now we have fabulous support. You can use Google things that will allow you to do this. If you know hardly anything, you can start building your own networks of these things. And we have the machine power to do them fast. And I'm saying that because, well, first of all, it feels a bit like magic. Okay, so also back in the 70s, there were people who were trying to write programs to recognise, digits in writing, in handwriting. And it's incredibly hard to write a program to actually deal with, if it looks like just a single stroke, it's probably a 1, but actually if it's 2 strokes, it's probably a 1, unless the second stroke is horizontal, in which case it's probably a 7, unless it's also got a serif on the bottom, in which case it's probably a 1 again. And all of this is happening with just little bits of variability. It's tough. A little bit of training in one of these things, you can actually get fabulous performance on things much harder than that, like recognising cats. So it's amazing how good they can be. But the magic isn't just, you do it and it's all cool. It's typically you do this like 1,000 times, and out of the 1,000 networks that result, you pick the one that you think is the one that does the job best. And then you say, here is my cat recognizer. Okay. So I'm telling you that because I'm interested in how these networks behave. And we really need to look into that. That's a really important problem. In fact, I'm going to spend a little while telling you why I think that's such an important problem. And by the way, I haven't decided whether this is sort of an admonition or just an encouragement or whatever. But if you're doing applied category theory, I really encourage you to really get in touch with the applied people, to actually be in touch with people who are really doing stuff and have real problems. It makes an incredible difference. I'm sort of doing that in a way, and I have to do this carefully not to sound critical. I have a lot of good friends who way back were doing applied category theory applications into computer science decades ago, but all of their stuff got published in something called theoretical computer science or something like that, which is really interesting that the applications were at the theory end of a business. It really is good to get close to the business, and I think we as a community are ready for that now. So I want to talk about at least a few cases of these things. The main work I've been doing is kind of boring and doesn't have pretty pictures and things with accountants. That's not a comment on accountants in general, but it is. And CEOs and boards and people like that. And I want to tell you why they're so interested and what their problems are. So first thing is they find it almost irresistible. Like I said, these systems can do quite amazing stuff. And so let's take an example. It might be a financial services company. Financial service company that gives people loans. If you want a loan, it makes you fill out a form with lots of information about yourself. Lots. And by the way, it also has some history of you as a customer, quite possibly. And it talks to credit providing agencies, and when it's allowed to, it talks to the police forces, and it gets an enormous number of variables about you. And a human being sits there and looks through these things and uses their professional judgment to say, will we give this person that loan, or will we offer them a bit less, or will we send them away again and they can go to somebody else? It's an important problem. so these guys have said, well, hang on a minute, I've got lots of examples of the forms and the information that was the input, and I know what my professional people sitting at their desk decided by way of the output, so why don't I build a machine learning system that can simulate what those people do? These guys, the boards, the CFOs, the chief financial officers and the CEOs, they really care about profit. And obviously there's profit to be made there because either I don't have to pay these guys to do the job anymore, or if I go on paying them, they can do more value-adding work instead of the routine work because, hey, or I can say, yeah, they're still going to do their job, but the system is going to sort of check them and provide them with extra input, extra information. So one way or another, it's a good thing. It's also really interesting that it might actually give them better profitability, because I can not only give the system what the people decided, I can give the system for training purposes all of the applications from more than 5 years ago, and for each one, whether or not they defaulted on their loan 5 years later. And so we're getting real information there for the system to use in its learning to make judgments about whether or not someone should get a loan. And so it will probably be a better system, it'll probably be cheaper to run, it's irresistible. Okay. I want to say something about this irresistibility too, because I'm going to give you some further examples later. In fact, there's some I've saved for the end that are cool pictures and things. Machine learning is finding its way into places we never thought it would, because there's really big questions as to whether it should be in those places, but it's irresistible. The opportunities to use. Why don't you guys come around and grab some chairs, because there's actually chairs and I really don't mind being briefly. Yep. So it's an irresistible thing, and we need to understand better what's going on. These guys recognise why they get me involved. They recognise they need to understand better what's going on. And it's because these systems are largely inscrutable. Okay? When a customer's loan is turned down, you can talk to the man or woman who turned it down and say, why did you turn it down? And they might say, oh, I was in a bad mood that day and I was probably tougher than I needed to be, but hey, look, their employment history is not so great and something else. You can't ask one of these machine learning systems, why did it come out as a 0? You can see why it came out as a 0. It came out as a 0 because the input wasn't big enough to make it a 1, and you can see where those inputs came from, but they don't mean anything. Furthermore, I'm almost concerned to say these things too, but furthermore, if you say to the person who made the decision, are you sure it wasn't because that was a, I don't know, pick your favourite prejudice, okay? Maybe the person was able to see the surname and that told them it was from a particular ethnic group, and that ethnic group has a reputation for not paying back their loans, and that would get you into trouble in most countries with the Equal Opportunity Commissioner. There are laws against making judgments like this in ways that are clearly inappropriate for an individual on the fact that statistically some kind of a group might maybe not do so well, or possibly because we mistreat them in the society that they're in, or might have a reputation for not doing so well that might even be false. So the person knows at least not to say that that affected them. Whether or not it did, I can't tell you, but they know not to say. The system, on the other hand, I said it was going to be more profitable possibly because it was going to do the better job. Statistically, it might actually do the better job by doing these unconscionable things like, yeah, recognising that kind of an end of a surname usually means it's from that group of people who usually end up defaulting on their loans, so we're not going to look very hard at this one, we'll just turn them down, which would be really bad. So these people think there's a great bottom line opportunity, but they also recognise they could be sued big time if it turned out the system was doing the wrong thing. And how do we work out whether or not the system's doing the wrong thing, or how do we prove to regulators that it's not? Well, that's really hard, and that needs mathematics, and that needs the kind of analysis that Brendan and David and Remy have begun for us by introducing these things called learners, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. Okay, I've got one more example just quickly to bring the point home, which is an unnamed Australian hospital. Here's another kind of problem that they thought, hey, look, machine learning could do this. I'm sorry if it's not a very pleasant problem, but anyway, it's really good to think applications, right? This hospital has lots of cardiac patients. Some of them come in after having had a really bad heart attack and having been resuscitated, or anyway, it was such a bad heart attack that one way or another they were in a coma. And one of the really difficult judgments a doctor has to make is this person likely to come out of that coma? Because, I mean, even for the family, you don't want to be having them at the bedside hoping for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks if this person is not going to come out of their coma. Apart from the obvious other thing, which is hospital resources are being spent on someone who isn't going to come out of a coma. We need to help the family to know that early and deal with it early and say their goodbyes. And conversely, of course, we don't want to get that wrong. You don't want to be saying, look, this is not going to work, we will take them off life support if it turned out that just maybe they might have done okay. And so the hospital said, hey, look, we can actually collect lots of data from our hospital and other hospitals and do a machine learning system that will be able to do this. And they said, by the way, it will just be helpful. So the doctors still make the judgments, but it's good for the family, really, to be able to go back and say, look, my professional judgment, for all these reasons, I really think your relative's not going to make it. And I've also run it through this fabulous big machine learning system, and it agrees with me and says, look, it's not going to happen. So it looked like a good idea to do that. And indeed, the machine learning system they had agreed with the doctors high 90% of the time. That has a couple of interesting implications. The system was built to be just a helper, and this happens over and over again. If you get high 90s kind of results, human beings actually start to believe the system. So after a while, if the doctor disagreed with the system, the doctor would say, oh wow, I guess I'm wrong. Or indeed, the doctors would not expend as much effort in making the judgment because, hey, the system right away says, well, if the system said that, that's probably true, and they just check out a few things. And so it actually changes from an assistance system to a potentially safety critical system. So it needs really careful analysis as to just how it's working. This has never worked in a serious way in the hospital. They've always kept it shadowed and been watching about how doctors perform against how the system performs and giving doctors some access to it, but not that access that can affect the safety critical side of things. But I said these systems were inscrutable, so we were amazed because for once we were able to work out something about this system. It did a really weird thing. So one of the things the doctors often do is look at kidney function. And it turns out if your kidneys are doing a certain thing, that means your lower brain is not talking to your kidneys. And if that really low, ancient bit of your brain is not talking, then you're not coming back. It's really, and it's a very long determined sure thing. And so they're the easy cases. The system actually said to a patient whose kidneys were doing that thing, said about a patient whose kidneys were doing that thing, keep the machine turned on, they might wake up. And that, like I said, people believed the system. People started thinking, oh, you know, maybe there's something about what's going on with this particular patient that actually means they really will wake up, even though we would have thought they wouldn't and taken them off the machine. We better check it out. And so they were looking into all kinds of stuff about kidney function and the connections between the brain and the kidney to make sure that the pathways in the spine were working properly and all that kind of thing. But it was really surprising because this patient was in a pretty bad way. He was actually an AIDS patient. And so he was already in advanced AIDS as well as all the other things that were going on. And they were very perplexed about how the system was saying this. And then a very clever young guy tried out changing some of the data of other patients in a really weird way. Now, there were people even thinking, hey, maybe AIDS somehow protects against or causes the kidneys to, or it's... Anyway, this person changed the data to give other patients on the records AIDS and see what the system said, and every time, if you've got AIDS, you're going to wake up. So we could actually understand what the system was doing for a change and why the system did it. When we went back and looked at the training data, 40,000 odd cases, there were 3 patients with AIDS. It just so happened all of them woke up. The system learnt perfectly reasonably, because this is all the data it had, hey, if you've got AIDS, don't worry about looking at other stuff, you're going to wake up. But the reason I'm telling you these things is to give you an idea of we have these systems that do fabulous things, sometimes in small proportions for absurd reasons that could get us into terrible trouble, either with regulators or making, at least in this case, it was the good decision. It's we'd leave a patient turned on and waste some resources and make the family worry for longer before turning them off, rather than the reverse one, which would be a terrible thing of turning someone off when there was a chance they might come through. Okay, you've got an idea now about machine learning and some of the things that mean they need mathematical analysis. We need to be able to actually pull these systems apart and do analysis inside them, and that's what Brendan and David and Remy have done for us with these so-called learners. So let's do some mathematics, okay? So learners are, their definition, sets, ABP, And think the picture I showed you with the cat, right? A is the input, the pixels coming in one end. B is the output, the 0, 1 in the case of the cat. And P is the parameters. In that case, all of the weights on all of the wires that we can adjust. Okay? And some functions. I says if you tell me the input and the parameters, I can tell you the output. That just means run the net, see what it does with some given input, see whether it says this is or isn't a cat. Okay? Easy enough? U is we're going to update the parameters. So if we give it the input and the parameters, it knows what it would say by way of output, but you don't say that, you say what it should say by way of output. And as a result, work out how to change the parameters to try and improve it. That's the learning in action. Okay? And the last one is probably their most significant additional, you guys should correct me if I say anything wrong, by the way, their most significant additional understanding, this thing they call a request function, which is in fact, you can see it in backpropagation in a way. It is saying if you give me the input and the parameters and the desired output, then I'll tell you an input that would have been better in some sense for getting that desired output. And that is actually part of how the backpropagation algorithm works. So it adjusts the parameters at the last layer, but it tells the layer before something that it would like that layer to have, which can then adjust its parameters until the layer before. And so that's the so-called request function. So these are called implement, although I like to think of it as just operate, just run, just do it. Update and request. Easy enough? Okay. So like I said about correcting me, this is how I think I have the story, and it's not important, but correct me if I'm wrong. So this is Jules Hedges' remark, I think. And if I've got the story right, Jules remarked it to Brendan, who told it to David, who was kind enough to send an email to me and Bob Roseborough, and we looked at it, and that's how I started looking at some of these things. And Jules said, hey, if we let P equals 1 in this, then we have what might be called a set-based bare lens. Okay. It's actually been at least 10 minutes since I told you what a lens was. So let me sort of quasi-remind you. A lens has a get and a put, and the set-based ones, it's just that, and they're just functions. And the bare is just saying, don't worry about those axioms I told you about. No put get, no get put, no put put, all that stuff. Just those two functions. Okay, so that's what a set-based bare lens is. And Jules's remark was saying, well, hang on a minute. If I take the P here and replace it by a whole lot of ones, then yeah, it's a set-based bare lens. I've got something that goes from A to B. I've got something that doesn't do anything because it just returns the same answer all the time. And I've got something that goes from A cross B to A. Set-based bare lens, yeah? Okay, so you could say lenses are learners. So every lens has a life as a learner in which the P's are ones. The is me editorialising. It's not in any way criticising Jules's remark, because Jules's remark has actually generated about 3 of this morning's papers in some sense. But I can't be too taken by lenses are learners, because they're learners that can't learn anything, right? It's the parameter set is fixed, so they never really learn anything. And so I confess, when I got that email and looked at this, I thought, yeah, it's probably a coincidence. Yeah, okay. Okay, back to learners. There's the learner thing again. But instead of saying P equals 1, I want to add some parentheses. And I want to pause for just long enough that you can think, oh, where's he going to add parentheses? Because I bet you'll figure it out for yourself. Okay, where's he going to add parentheses? Well, here they are. So I'll just put this A cross P together. What have I got now? I've got something that goes from a set A cross P to B, and something that goes from A cross P plus B back to A cross P. So I have another one of those bare lenses. Okay, of course, I don't have to fuss about it with category theorists that we've broken up onto P cross A into 2 parts at the bottom there, but it's a bare lens, right? It's a get function and put function. Okay, that looks a bit more interesting. And so now this is actually saying learners are lenses. Whenever you've got a learner, it is a lens. Sure, a bare lens, just like this. Does that mean anything? Who knows? Is it a coincidence? Who knows? But the obvious question is, how do they compose? So if they compose like lenses compose, then I might start to think there's something going on here. Okay, so how do they compose? So here's, I'm sorry, it looks like lots of letters, but it's not hard. Here's the definition of composite of 2 learners. So a learner that goes from A to B with parameters P and 3 functions, IUR, and another one that goes from B to C with parameters Q and 3 functions. have composite, it'll go from A to C, fair enough. The parameter space will be the product of the parameter spaces because all those parameters are all there to vary independently. So that's fair enough too. And we have to say what the three functions are, and that's what this stuff does. But let's just go through them for a minute. The first one says if you want to get from A to C and your parameter space is now P cross Q, well, what can you do? Well, you can use the I part on the A and the P to get a B thing, which you can then use the J part on with Q to get a C thing. Is that all right? Does that feel a bit like HG? Yep. Okay. It's probably best to jump straight to the bottom. And I apologise to the people way over there, but at least you can see it over here probably. Jump straight to the bottom. I'll keep pointing there if that's all right. So straight at the bottom, what are we trying to do? We're trying to do a kind of a feedback of requests. Okay. And so S was the second one. And S, if you give it a Q and a C, which you've got, and a B, can tell you what to take back into the B state, into the middle. We're trying to go backwards, bidirectional transformations. Well, what can you put in the middle? Well, the only thing you can get, given that you've got A and P and Q, is IAP is how you can get a B. So we can get ourselves a B, then we do the request function for it with QC, and we've then got a B, which we can put into the request function with A and P to get back one more step. Sound all right? And I think you can probably see that that's exactly the composite of the puts. Okay, so now I'm beginning to think, yeah, these things really are. I was going to walk you through this one. It's not surprising, right? It's the hardest thing to see is this is a pair, because after all it's returning a P cross Q. And so you break it up into the 2 bits, and the 2 bits play this same trick with IAP in them a couple of times in the appropriate places, but you could make it up for yourself. It's not worth the minutes talking it through. I hope that doesn't mean I have to stop or something. Some beep, 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 beep. Good. Okay. So that's composition of learners, and hey, look, it looked a lot like composition of lenses. Now I'm starting to think something's going on. Okay. So we literally should compare these composites and make them precise. So does this mean the composition of learners is a special example of the composition of these are sometimes called asymmetric lenses, the ones where a system knows all the stuff, the ones I've shown you so far. So are learners really asymmetric lenses? And the answer is, well, actually, look, these are the 2 things I had now in their lens formulation, and they're not even composable. So even though the composite looks kind of like the same sort of stuff, we can't compose them together. Okay, they're bare asymmetric lenses, their compositions are similar, but the correspondence we have so far doesn't work. I'm just making sure you look sad. You look sad? Yep. Okay, but yeah, how about we try and force it? So right, I had this A cross P went to B and B cross Q went to C and said, hey, they don't match. But suppose I product A cross B to B with Q. That just means running 2 lenses in parallel, and one of the lenses is just going to be the identity lens on Q. It's not going to do anything interesting anyway. So it's going to work really easily. Now they're composable. Now we can actually calculate their composite, and that is really this picture exactly. So now the compositions really do line up, and it says that's significant down there because finally now I believe there is some really close connection between these 2. Now you're allowed to be happy. Okay, but it's still kind of weird, right? You know, what's this multiplying with Q business? And if it was something else, I'd be multiplying with something else. And I suspect Zinvi is going to say something Kleisli-ish at some stage in the morning. But it's okay. Anyway, the lenses really ought to go from A to B and B to C, not from A cross P to B or A cross P cross Q to B cross Q or stuff like that. And it turns out the bidirectional transformation people have pretty much what we need to do this. So do you want to see it? So, need a little bit of background first, tiny bit of background. Constant complement lenses have been around for years and years, and they're obvious. Again, if you had to make them up, you'd make them up. So the gets are just projections. So now the big system is a product of 2 systems, and the get is just tell me the stuff about one half of the product. Okay, that's easy. The put is just going to say, okay, well, when you want to put an A prime into that system, well, of course, you replace the A with the A prime and you leave the P alone. And that's why it's called constant complement. The other half, the P stuff, doesn't change. It's kept constant. Okay, simple, straightforward. They satisfy all of the lens properties, all of the axioms you'd want, all those things. Life is easy. It says at the bottom they're widely used and well understood. I don't just mean by lens people or bidirectional transformation people or Haskell programmers using lenses. I mean, they're built into SQL view updating and stuff like that. They're all over the world, these things, so they're easy. Okay, constant complement, all good, but an example of a lens, and if you hadn't thought of it before now, it's a good one to have in your head, although I'd prefer you to think just split opfibration. Okay, the other bit of technology you need is so-called symmetric lenses. So let me just, these two systems, I said in the earlier ones we had a lens, one system knew everything, the other system could be derived from it. It's way more common to have two systems, both of which know some stuff the other system doesn't know. And so this is a kind of symmetric situation, and so the relevant lenses for them are called symmetric lenses. Actually, a few of you were here a few years ago when I gave a lecture course about these things here in Oxford, and told you about an early version of these like 40 years ago that I was working on, actually when I was a very young man, as a very junior person in a team, and we were building this, and it was interesting, and if you want, I'll tell you about it because it was really interesting because the internet doesn't exist, so the actual communication between the two systems was difficult because they were in different companies. But anyway, that's another story. A symmetric lens, how you deal with this case is easy. You just use a span of asymmetric lenses. No problem. And I could show you all the details, but really you can figure it out for yourself. That will do everything you need to do. So if you understand asymmetric lenses, then you understand the symmetric ones. Okay. Somewhere it should say equivalence classes. In this span, if I whacked some extra stuff in the middle, hidden stuff that didn't do anything, it'd still be kind of the same symmetric lens. So I need to take an equivalence relation that says, I don't really care too much about what's going on in the middle, as long as the way the two systems are interacting with one another is the same, the lenses are the same. So there's an equivalence class of spans, but like many examples of where we work with equivalence classes, if you think of a representative, you're fine. Okay, here's a typical representative. I'm actually going to do, in fact, you can probably see why I've picked it, right? So this is the constant complement lens, A cross P projecting onto A. And here's the lens I showed you a minute ago that comes from a learner. You've got the I of it, and the put is built out of the R and the Q. So that's an example of an asymmetric lens. Okay, once I've got that, I can tell you this theorem. So there's an identity on object, symmetric monoidal functor. So functor means the composition stuff I've told you already, preserves composition. The monoidal aspect is just we can run things in parallel. There's an identity on object, symmetric monoidal functor from learners to symmetric lenses of that form. And so this has now made really precise the sense in which, okay, the learners that three clever people invented to be able to give us a chance to break up these systems and analyse them, turn out to be symmetric lenses, and like I said, I really didn't believe that was going to happen. So it's a really interesting thing, and there's the main result. Here are some remarks. So I've kind of left out most of the details about equivalence relations, but it's fine. It all goes through okay. They, by the way, provided an example of something that helped. What you'll find in the paper by Brendan and David and Remy has a slightly different notion of equivalence than the one that actually belongs here. At least they've told me, maybe they're just humouring me, that the one I would use is the right one. They're using a finer equivalence, as many people do, right? There's an obvious fine equivalence you should put on these, and then, actually, better to say this. Remember the cat picture again? If I whacked in some extra nodes and things and weights and things that didn't actually make any difference to the end, it would still be in some sense the same thing, right? They never learnt anything, they never did anything. So there is a bigger equivalence relation on learning systems than just a kind of isomorphism one. And that lines up exactly with the equivalence relation that we would do. And that at least became clear to me by seeing the two next to one another via this correspondence that we've got. I said, well, almost about the technology. So it turns out the composition of symmetric lenses is defined normally when you've got well-behaved lenses. I kept saying bare along the way here. Bare lenses, ones that don't have any of the axioms. Well-behaved is shorthand for put get and get put axioms are satisfied. So there's no guarantee they are satisfied. So we had to generalise how you compose symmetric lenses, but it turns out you can do it really well as long as at least one leg, one side of the span, does satisfy put get, and indeed one side of the span is constant complement, which satisfies everything you could want, including put get. So that's how that generalises really easy. It's a big surprise that supervised learning and symmetric lenses are so intimately related. So I could pause there and say, can I show you some pictures? I don't know whether I've overdone the examples already, but like I said, applied category theory should be about examples. There's some really nice examples that come from autonomous systems, in particular autonomous vehicles. And Zinovy, who's going to talk later on this morning, actually does a lot of work with car manufacturers and so on. So I wanted to do some real things. This is actually Phil Copeman's stuff. Phil is at CMU but was in Australia a few weeks ago, and we were talking about these things. So think, and maybe they're in your town being tested, right? There are these places where there are autonomous vehicles driving around. An autonomous vehicle has to have ways of controlling the vehicle and stuff like that. That's what vehicle manufacturers have been building forever. So that's easy. Somewhere back here it's got to have planning where it's saying, hang on a minute, there's a bunch of kids on the side of the road, I'm driving at 60 miles an hour and they could step onto the road, I better slow down, and stuff like that. Sound all right? But if it's going to make judgments like that, it has to have perception. It has to have machine vision of some kind that gives it a chance to work out, hey, that's a bunch of kids and not a tree or something. Trees don't tend to jump out into the road while you're driving along, and you can drive past them at 60 miles an hour. It's completely okay. This is sometimes called the pipeline for autonomous vehicles. And that stuff is well understood. This stuff is hard, but the safety critical people try to get in here and say, oh, we'll make sure it doesn't go outside of its operation envelope, and put in some pretty serious stuff to control this. But here is where we're doing machine learning, and I want to remind you again, machine learning might decide that people with AIDS are really likely to wake up when they're in a terrible state and stuff like that. So what the machine learning is doing is a dangerous thing, even though it's an irresistible thing because it's 99% right. And it's essential if we're going to have autonomous vehicles. Sound okay? Okay, so I hope I've got the picture clear to you. Remember, these autonomous vehicles learn by training sets, and we give them great big training sets of things of trees and houses and kids and people, and try to get them to learn to recognise them, and then that can be fed into the planning to do the right thing. The next point I want to make is your training set is never big enough, not for driving around the world. So, so you look at this guy and you think person. Right? Apparently there's some places in the US where the fast food joints advertise by having man run around in chicken suit. The machine learning systems don't think person. In fact, a lot of machine learning systems now on autonomous vehicles are entirely clever enough to say bird, and will say about that bird. And birds are great when you're driving because mostly they just get out of your road. They fly when you get close enough. And what's more, if I'm wrong, dead bird, but car's just a bit dirty, so it's no big deal. Which is a bad mistake to make in that kind of circumstance. Okay, let's go to the other side. I couldn't resist having this one in there because it's just down the road here, which way is southwest. Anyway, that's the Swindon roundabout of roundabouts. The reason it's there is because this system has to be able to interpret road signs, and there are some road signs that are uniquely complicated, and that's one example. But hey, if you teach it to drive at Swindon, there'll be somewhere else in the world where the road sign has some crazy thing in it that's really tough. It's mostly Oxford people who know what I'm talking about there. This is obviously man with bicycle, right? But it's a hard categorization problem. So it's either man with bicycle, man walking bicycle, like bicycle is luggage, in which case it behaves like a man and it can only move as fast as a man, and if it's far enough off the road it's not going to get to the road until after you've driven past and you can just keep going fast. Or, and you can imagine it's hard to tell, it could be man on bicycle who can now move as fast as a bicycle, and you might have to slow down for because he might be in front of you at any moment in time. So there's really tough decisions to make there, and worse still, it could be man walking bicycle who's just about to swing his leg over and turn from man into vehicle, and we need to do these categorizations, and they're tough. This is near Phil. There's an Air Force base where they actually routinely move the fighters from one place to another on the main highway. So you probably didn't design your machine vision system to expect to see a fighter jet on the road and know how to maneuver around it. And this one is probably the biggest worry. Well, I don't know what it is, but I'd look at that and think it's time to slow down. The machine vision systems look at it and say, oh, it's a car, it's in its lane, it's going the other way, I don't need to worry about it, I can drive past it 60 miles an hour. Chances are that whatever it's doing, there's a hole on my side of the road too, and I shouldn't just keep on driving. Anyway, the point is you can train for all these things, but there's going to be more of them. The safety guys worked out, look, it's okay, if you want to do what they're doing, which is drive around and test, Yeah, that'll be all right as long as you drive every paved road in the planet 20 times return trips without changing the software at all and nothing goes wrong, then it's okay. But of course, if anything goes wrong, you're back to square one, start again, driving the whole planet. It's not going to happen. But there's a big discrepancy between how AI people think and how safety people think, and it's really interesting to watch it playing out here. Anyway, you know, like they're good at identifying lampposts and houses and things, and lampposts don't step out in front of you and houses don't step out in front of you. At least not usually, but sometimes you get a house and it could step out in front of you and you need to worry about it. Kangaroos, so because I'm Australian I had to put it there. Kangaroos it didn't recognise at all. This is a real live machine learning system from a real manufacturer on real autonomous vehicles. Doesn't recognise kangaroos as animals because all the animals it's trained on that aren't birds have a leg, usually several, on the road, on the ground at any given point in time. And kangaroos sort of become an animal and then stop being an animal, and because they hop crazily. The cars are often really careful of people on the road who happen to be just pictures of people on vehicles. You might have heard about the Chinese actress who got lots of demerit points on the social system because she was jaywalking thousands of times in weird places because her picture was on the back of a bus, and so she was a person who, according to the machine learning systems, wasn't where she should be. I'll skip that one for now because my time is short. I'll skip that one for now because my time is short. I just want to do this one because this is showing what the system can and can't do. So it's not surprising that if the vision is hard for us to see, it's hard for the system to see. You know, we sometimes do get tricked by someone who's on the road who we didn't really see because the sun was in our eyes or whatever. Children, on the other hand, are a real problem because the system often sees children as like luggage. They're attached to a person and the person's walking. But of course the child, if they let go of that hand, might do something crazy. Weirdly, red objects are often mistaken as people. I don't know how you can look at that and see a person, but it's no big problem if the system thinks there's a person because it's probably not a big problem. Much more worryingly, especially if you're female, women with bare legs are often not recognised as people. I think I understand, right? Snow is a real problem for these systems. So lots of the training data is Northern Hemisphere winter stuff. And you don't see many bare legs in Northern Hemisphere winter. That's one thing. What's more, animals tend to have really skinny legs. And compared with what dressed people look like, bare legs look really skinny, and so often they get missed. There's a problem with posts. Here's my absolute favourite, and then I'll stop, which is, I said red objects get recognised, right? Okay, so this is a road worker who was walking down the side of the road, and the system knows it's a person, and maybe they'll step on the road, and we better be careful and stuff like that. They had to come out and stop the cars. So being sensible, they put on their safety high visibility vest. Red objects aren't recognised as people, are recognised as people. Yellow objects are not recognised as people. You put on your safety vest, you disappear to the system. By the way, testing doesn't reveal that much because mostly these guys don't get run over because they know how to be really careful because they're in a dangerous job all the time and they stay out of the road of the cars. But exactly what they're doing to be safe makes them invisible to the system. We need to be able to mathematically understand these systems. Thank you to Brendan and David and Remy for giving us the first step, Functoriality, to understand these systems. And isn't it weird that it turns out to be the same thing as symmetric lenses with a left leg constant complement? Thanks.
I'm going to abuse my power and just say I encourage everybody in the room to think as deeply as Mike about what they're doing. Okay, questions? Any questions? Go.
Is anyone trying to already exploit this connection between lenses and murders in some way?
So those of us that know about it are trying to look at what the lens laws might mean in machine learning situations. Zinovy is going to talk in about an hour's time about some examples of how he's trying to exploit it in different ways. At the moment, it's still very local, but we're talking to real people in the real world, and we hope. Like I said, Functoriality is just the first step. I didn't want to say to clever people who have done a wonderful thing, oh, it's just a tiny thing. It's just a tiny thing in the sense of what we need to do to have a mathematical analysis of these things, but it's a really big first step. It's the vital first step that we have to have.
So, Bob Walters had a construction. I've got a monoidal category, then I can construct a new category out to it, which is like that category, but you have parameters. So a map from A to B is a map from A tensor P to B, And then parameters sticking next to each other. So I'm just wondering if I could use that on my category of asymmetric lenses.
What a very good question. You remember earlier I said I'm not sure whether I should blush, but he just mentioned Bob Walters. I was Bob Walters' student, so and I hadn't thought about it at all or made the connection at all. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. So learners is era. What you is that thing of lens?
Excellent.
Another way to get learners as just that construction applied to it.
Okay, we reinvented some of what Bob Walters did.
I'm going to briefly mention this in the next talk.
Ah, good.
So, yeah, but I didn't know this was so old.